Good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me. I'm aware that there are potentially some sound issues. My name is Justin Bronk. I'm the Research Fellow for Airpower at RUSI, and I'm here to welcome you to the final panel of what's been a fascinating day. Today, in this case, looking at the need for naval forces or maritime forces in the round to be able to switch rapidly between competition and warfighting, and indeed also switch between operations in blue water and the littoral environment, which, as I'm sure we've heard in great detail, are significantly different challenges. We have an enormous amount of expertise from both sides of the Atlantic, as well as from Japan, to join us today, including making me feel particularly small and ill-read. 3 participants with both senior rank titles and a PhD to their name. So we will begin with Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Frank Hoffman, who is a Senior RUSI Associate Fellow, and then move on to Colonel Dr. Thomas Hames. Then we will hear from Vice Admiral Yoji Koda, retired from the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Forces. And finally, but not least, Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry. I assure you that all of their bios are in your delegate packs, and I'm guessing that given this is a significant collection of expertise, and we don't have all the time in the world, people would rather I didn't read them out line by line. So if everyone's happy, I remind participants that, as always, the Q&A is off the record, but the presentations are on. So if you wish to use any of the remarks made in the subsequent Q&A, you need to contact our participants in writing. Other than that, Dr. Frank Hoffman, over to you to begin, please, sir.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Justin, for that. And thank you for the invitation to this really well-designed conference today. I'm honored to be part of RUSI as an associate fellow this year, and I'm equally honored to be again on stage with such a prestigious panel, particularly Admirals Koda and Admiral Parry. It's been some time since we've seen each other. The mission I had today from the chair was to offer some thoughts on how a high-intensity war could arise from what many call gray zone operations or a period of competition. I agree with Peter's comments earlier today that perhaps some of our terminology is not well defined. But the issue I'm particularly tasked to discuss today is kind of the flip side of the question that General Petraeus asked a number of years ago about how wars ends. The question today that I'm working on is how wars might begin. Of course, just a few years ago, it was very fashionable for some in the academic community to think that war had somehow been relegated to the dustbin of history, that we had reached the end of history, and that war between major powers was going to go away. I think most informed defense security officials, those with historical background, understand that that's ahistorical, a bucket of nonsense or codswallop in British slang, and an illusion if we had made the kind of investments that those advocates were calling for. So gray zone operations, what I prefer to call measures short of war, a term introduced by George Kennan 50 years ago, is not a new form of conflict, as some allege, and it's especially relevant to those who are well schooled in the indirect approaches that are very common to Russian and Chinese thinking. They are something, however, that do bedevil the conventionally minded militaries and perhaps some of our policy masters. So studying this particular area and the transition from competition to conflict is something that we ought to think about. The American scholar Mike Mazar at Rand has written a truly excellent monograph on this particular topic. And I think his best point is that gray zone tactics, those employed by Russia and China in particular, are inherently risky, and they should be understood as such. So I'd like to lay out 5 possible scenarios, which are represented on this singular slide today, that I'm going to use to discuss 5 potential ways in which competition could transition in very short order from the gray zone to the red zone. And this picks up on the conversation we had earlier this morning with the first panel, with our discussions about rationality, and also I think the points that Tony Korsman brought out about chance, something that we have to give some respect to. So the first scenario on my list is what I call the failed fait accompli scenario. This is when red miscalculates and thinks it can seize the day without a reaction from the West or from the blue side, ourselves. To those in the United Kingdom, the notion of a failed fait accompli scenario occurred in 1982 when the Argentines believed that they could seize the day in the Falklands and that there would not be a response from the government of the day. They misread the prime minister, they misread the country, they misread popular support, and they misread the readiness status of the British Armed Forces of the day. And there was a movement along with diplomacy that ended up in a series of actions that ended up resulting in a major confrontation that was violent. I can see in the modern scenario today something in the Baltics or the Black Sea, perhaps off the Taiwan coast, where Russia or China again misperceives and miscalculates the ability of the West to respond. They see a time and distance, they see perhaps a dysfunctional government, they see polarization, or they see a weak in the alliance architecture, and they try to strike. I think that's a increasingly realistic scenario that could occur. And an approaching naval task force operating in out in the global commons and moving into that contact zone, just like in 1982, could result in a series of steps. I don't think it's hard to imagine the interaction of policy demands, the fear, honor, and interest of one state interaction with another one that could put naval power in harm's way rather quickly. I don't think in 1982 language that Mrs. Thatcher took out a piece of paper and was working her Thomas Schelling-esque escalation ladder when she was responding. And I'm not sure that a future national leader is going to do the same. The second scenario I have painted out here today is related to the fait accompli, and it's what I call the preemptive counter fait accompli. Sorry, I have a typo there. Fait accompli, in which the blue side miscalculates Red's intentions. It misreads a exercise in the Taiwan Strait. It misreads a Zapad exercise along the frontier. It misreads a Coast Guard deployment from a Russian border outfit in the Black Sea as the first steps of a fait accompli, which it wants to block because it knows that once a fait accompli occurs, it's going to be difficult to change situations without destroying a host country or getting involved in a very violent confrontation. So the blue response to a misreading of red results in a confrontation that gets out of hand and it turns into a shooting war. I could see in the modern scenario, I don't have a very good historical scenario to fall back upon as an example, but I do see something in the Black Sea or something of an amphibious, large-scale amphibious operation in the South China Sea or off the coast of Taiwan as producing that sort of interaction that could be misinterpreted. It would not be perhaps a deliberate activity, but it could be a natural, understandable interaction between red and blue that would bring about a conflict of some type. The third example I put up is just a threshold miscalculation. And I think, that was brought up a little bit in the earlier panel today. One of the historical examples I use often in the classroom is Hezbollah in 2006, totally misread Israel's threshold, misread its line. Public opinion in Israel had changed. Hezbollah tried a small kidnapping operation. The leadership of Israel had come to a decision and had changed their threshold, and Hezbollah just didn't understand that kind of an operation, the securing of hostages and the propaganda play of holding Israeli soldiers as hostages was something that was a new threshold for Israel that they could not accept. And it resulted in a major confrontation of 38 days that killed hundreds of people, thousands of missiles on both sides for a period of time. So miscalculation is something we need to understand. I can see in a modern example, I can see in the Russia Black Sea operation by a border security force escalating perhaps against a NATO member and NATO feeling that it had to respond. I think this is the whole problem, gets to the essence of the problem with gray zone operations and competition perhaps. There's just a risky presumption in salami slicing tactics that you know where these lines are, and that as you slice the salami, that you don't nick a vein or cut an artery, by mistake. I don't think the threshold lines are static, and that they're certainly not always clear. I see a lot of reckless activity from Russia, flying overs, ship handling. I think the odds of a chance encounter in the air, over the sea, or in a port is growing much higher today than it has been in the past. It is hard to see it necessarily escalating into a full-blown war, but I think the chance of a violent exchange at sea is quite appreciable. I'm not as comfortable, I think, with Dr. Kordersman's comments that all the incentives favor de-escalation. And I think I agreed with Mike Hoffman that thresholds are something we don't know enough about, and that there's factors that could accelerate a war rather than de-escalate a war. My fourth scenario is what I call the surrogate saving scenario. Contrary to some how read history, great power competition is often associated with proxy wars and proxy forces that are engaging so that the great powers do not come into direct conflict. The notion of escalation is known by the great powers, so they attempt often not to have their forces in direct contact with each other to preclude an escalation, but also sometimes they have to save their proxies. A proxy force is accepting some risk when it takes sponsorship and it is fighting for somebody. We have blue forces fighting for us in the Middle East. They're taking some risk about our ability to protect them and to provide support to them. The example I've been using lately is thinking about the private military contractor company, the Wagner Group, that is a preferred PMC for Russia forces on the ground. We're seeing more PMCs in ports and at sea as well. We're seeing a lot of surrogate forces. At some point in time, a great power may have to come to the rescue of its force. A number of years ago in 2017, Russia did not escalate and try to save the Wagner Group company that was moving on an American base against American forces and was decimated by Airpower. But there is going to be this interaction of proxy forces that I think we need to think about. When the Chinese start introducing armed merchant ships, when they start authorizing their Coast Guard to take more offensive and assertive actions, when they start using fishing vessels in the way they are, I think they're taking a degree of risk. And it's possible that they may find the utility in if there's an interaction of coming to the rescue of that, and that could climb up and become much more escalatory than we've seen in the past. Proxy forces are not going to work for great powers long if they find themselves being sacrificed as pawns and crushed every time. So I think there's a risk there. My fifth and my final example is what I call Sarajevo by the sea, and I was pleased that to see Dr. Kordersman made a couple of references to that. The tinder that's in great power competition can get out of hand. The single extremist with 2 pistol shots that began the war is obviously an oversimplification of a much longer confrontation between great powers, but we need to recall the fact that there is a hinge factor in history. And the Hinge Factor book by Eric Derschmied is very interesting. His subtitle, How Chance and Stupidity Have Changed History. So the overemphasis on rationality is something I think we should be very careful about. So let me wrap up. The final point, I think, is to talk about the nature of technology and our expectations about technological change in the battle space. There is a increasing emphasis on first mover advantages from both precision strike weapons and unmanned systems, and a lot of pressure towards seizing the first mover advantage by going first and going large in a conflict, often associated with the cyber and space demands, but it's also in the maritime demand as well. If you follow China's strategic writings, you will note that they advocate when crises are emerging that, quote, seizing the initiative early through rapid, violent, and preemptive attack is part of their strategic thought process. And even in the United States Navy, in its new operational doctrine and the writings of folks like the late, great Professor Wayne Hughes of the Naval Postgraduate School, the principle of striking effectively first is promoted by the United States Navy. And that could create pressures when we interact striking effectively and striking early in the hand. So if both Chinese and American officers have this principle foremost in their mind, it's not very hard to see how a minor gambit in the gray zone could become blood red very quickly. The transition between peace and war, between gray and red, may be more unexpected, faster, and more violent than we're currently conceiving of it. And with that, I'll turn it over to our excellent panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hoffman, and thank you also for keeping to time. With no further delay, should we move on to Dr. Hames? The floor is yours, sir.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here with a distinguished panel, and Frank too. I will not be using any slides because there are 3-syllable words in my slides, and there are going to be pilots in the audience. So we don't want to confuse those guys. I was asked to talk about how do you figure on posture as you move to warfighting? Where do you put your balance? And so for my purposes, I drew on the U.S. national defense strategy. Each nation has to draw on its own, but the changing operational environment will be the same for all of us. Geography and oceanography are specific to theater. I'll talk briefly about that. And then the specific enemy changes how you structure your posture. The U.S. national defense strategy sees posture as both permanent forces, rotational forces, exercise forces, and incident response forces. So your actual posture changes over the course of a year. And this is why Secretary Mattis wanted to change the very regular scheduled forward deployment, because it made it too easy to understand what our posture would be. And then we discuss layers. The contact layer is the one that's always out there, that is in contact with the host nations, forces, training with them. The blunt layer are the U.S. forces that are deployed forward and are there with the mission of holding the line. Surge are those that will come from other places to help in that particular conflict. And in homeland, of course, are those that are going to defend the homeland. Interesting, homeland is a new concept for us. For 70 years, we haven't really had to worry about that other than nuclear strike, but it's really an issue and a costly problem. And then we have as part of developing this, we've developed the concept of inside versus outside forces. Inside forces are primarily contact and blunt right now, but that's changing. So what's the operating environment? I think the thing we've got to accept is we're facing very soon 24/7 global surveillance in visual, IR, and synthetic aperture radar from commercial systems. Already we're imaging the entire planet every 24 hours in visual and IR. And very rapidly we're establishing synthetic aperture networks. That is going to happen very, very quickly as we move to constant surveillance 24/7. So the idea of hiding is not going to happen. There's increasing underwater surveillance from a number of systems that will make the subsurface conflict zone extraordinarily difficult. One of the big things is proliferation of long-range precision strike, and more of that will be autonomous. So the idea of you're going to jam the command and control link simply won't be there. It will be autonomous, operating. The Israeli Harpy has been doing this for years. There are no loitering munitions now that do this. And finally, we've got to account for the return of mass. As you move into advanced manufacturing, you begin to develop the ability to very quickly produce lots of stuff. One of the interesting things, GE has redesigned an engine for an aircraft in Europe, had 855 parts. When they started to redesign, they turned it over their 3D print and advanced manufacturing team. It now has 12 parts. Obviously much easier to maintain, install, and build. So let's move on to geography. I'm going to start with Europe because of the location of the conference. The fundamental problem in Europe is shared boundaries and therefore very, very short distances for the forces to move, physical forces, occupying forces. Second problem, and based on our previous way we defended this, APODs, airports of debarkation, and SPODs, seaports of debarkation, are all within range of Russian forces at the start. Have extraordinarily poor land lines of communication, get all the way out to the border with Russia, and sea communications are much better because of the extremely confined waters entering and exiting the Baltic Sea, as well as the Baltic Sea itself. Therefore, they're going to have to need to deter by a combination of denial and punishment. Naval forces will be helpful to this fight, but not central. You'll be able to lend firepower, but not a great deal else to the fight. So what's the inside force in European theater? Well, right now it's multinational with the battalions that are sent forward. but it's currently way too small and is poorly equipped for the type of fight. We're still thinking in terms of herds of tanks fighting other herds of tanks. That is not where we are today. The Poles are beginning to get the idea. They've taken some cheap drones, put RPG warheads on them, and have a weapon that can at 30 kilometers hunt an armored vehicle. They have adopted the Israeli, I think it's called a Shrike missile, out of the back of a 113 that at 30 kilometers, it'll punch a hole in a tank or any other vehicle, fully autonomous hunter. That's what we have to have. That combined with lots and lots of IEDs. We never solved IEDs in Europe or in Afghanistan. We won't solve them there. I've written an entire paper on that. Since it focuses on ground, I won't go into more detail in this conference. The outside force here requires a shift in priorities. Have to thicken the ISR so that we can tell where the Russian forces are on the ground and then exploit long-range precision fires to get them. Rather than buying the next generation of fighter bombers, which will have to operate from known airfields and be under constant surveillance and be easy to kill on the ground, we need to look at lots and lots of much less expensive cruise missiles, precision weapons, the loitering munitions type things that we saw the Azerbaijanis use so successfully against the Armenians. That's a trade-off with current force structure. That's the single biggest problem, getting a new idea into people's heads. Naval will be missile craft, subs, and mines. Now we'll move to the Indo-Pacific, and geography there favors the defense because A2AD works both ways. The whole idea of, oh, we can't go in there because the Chinese have got all these missiles on land. We can put missiles in Japan. Japan is starting that with regiments of anti-ship cruise missiles. We could do this same process with the Philippines. The Marine Corps has obviously moved that way with a number of experiments with firing anti-ship cruise missiles off truck mounts. So those are all there. China has to cross the sea. There are maritime choke points that allow us to completely cut the PLAN off from the open ocean with the right application of force and also terminate their trade. We have three lines, not just the first island chain, but if you get that penetrated, you fall back to Malacca, Lombok, Sunda straight line. And if you lose that, you can fall all the way back to the Strait of Hormuz, Red Sea, Cape of Good Hope, and still cut China off from its essential trade and energy. So what's the inside force? Well, currently it's both a contact and blunt layer. Anybody on the first island chain is in range. You're in the fight from the get-go. It must also soon include many surge forces and homeland security because cruise missiles mounted on merchant ships, which we're seeing a number of nations test that concept, mean that every single bomber base in the United States is in range of a cruise missile from the start. And so we've got to understand that. If you're out there in the first island chain, you've got to blend in or get overhead cover to survive. An overhead cover can be either digging in or simply parking your equipment in an overhead garage. There are large built-up areas that can provide lots of good concealment. Minimize remote. You've got to minimize your signal generation, remote it. Again, passive sensors. Remote your firing batteries. There's no reason people have to be around your firing. If you put them in containerized systems, you can put them out there. They fire from a distance, you fire them, and you never go back and pick up the gear. Missile ships and smart mines close off the thing. The outside force problem is it has to initially back up the littoral fence by defeating penetrations. You aren't going to stop everything at the passes, but you can defeat penetration. And the blockade can be established at a distance by the outside force. You got to defend key allied facilities as we do this transition from where we are now, where everything we have is big, expensive, and tied to bases. We've got to figure out how to defend that as we move to a different force structure. You've also got to figure out the mid-ocean fight. This is where carriers have a forte and maybe the last useful role for carriers other than bombing tribesmen. The enemy has to fight to get to the fight. So he'll have to fight through the first island chain, be a significantly weakened force when he runs into the carrier force in the deep sea. So what do I think the focus has to be? It has to be on warfighting because that's the highest risk. The gray zone is not existential. This thing could be. You've got to hold the line. But we've got to move rapidly to small, smart, and many. The U.S. Air Force claims to have designed and built prototypes of a fighter aircraft in 2 years. What would happen if we decided instead, the Navy's already got the Tomahawk cruise missile with a ship attack version out to 1,100 miles. What happens if we do that and we try to say, can you make it cheap? Can you get me one for $300,000 or $400,000 and make this really cheap and ubiquitous? We've got to do combined training. While I really appreciated Brian's talked to Dan, the U.S. Navy, I noticed a distinct absence of any support from shore forces. What in the heck are the missile-based forces or perhaps air-based forces in transiting bases doing for you? And then this also allows you to tie in politically with the first island nation forces. Right now, nobody, well, the Japanese are buying some F-35s, but it's god awful expensive. And our US Air Force is even admitting we can't sustain it. So what do we do? Well, the answer is you'd look for cheaper things. If you can buy them lots and lots of cruise missiles, then they can do that. And that would be the key. You can also do training on humanitarian response or on the Ring of Fire that builds together the integration of the forces. So a combination of providing them with weapons that they can both develop and produce themselves, and then man in conjunction with US forces strengthens the alliance. And I will leave it there and turn it over to the next panelist. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hames. So far, we've had the scenarios where things could go really wrong and all of the tools on both sides which could come to symbolize what would go really wrong when it happens. Now, if I can turn over to Vice Admiral Koda, and sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm Yoji Koda, speaking from Tokyo, Japan at 0130 in the morning, but still I'm okay. Okay, so let's save time. Please go to the second slide. Okay, today I'm going to discuss mainly the high-end war and just using the China's A2AD as an example. And for us, what is a high-end war? You know, especially for the Navy or Marines, the high-end war in a short way of saying after World War II is, after World War II, thanks to the overwhelming naval capability of the United States, supported by European NATO and Japan, Western navies or Western militaries never had a time to worry about sea control. No one had challenged. Soviet did some, but other than that, no other nation than the Western allies have challenged our sea control. But when we think about the coming conflict or war against China, that is not. China has a capability to challenge our overall sea control capability. But for us to win the war or to bring the war to an advantageous end, we need to control the sea. So, no, but how to fight? That's my definition, the high-end war. Then let me move to the A2AD as an example. How Chinese military fight against the US forces in Indo-Pacific, supported by Japan, Australia, and to some extent Korea and India. And China would use all of their full asset, C4ISR and conventional forces supported by AI and remote vehicle. And newcomers, anti-ship ballistic missiles and hypersonic anti-ship missiles. And everyone already discussed EMP, anti-satellite, cyber, or destruction of the seabed fiber optics networks. So those are the Chinese, the asset or operational objectives to weaken the allied capability. And where do we fight? We are going to fight in a high-end war against China. We are going to fight in all domains, air, sea, land, including the underwater and space, information, and cyber domains. So we need to prepare ourselves as a European NATO allies and Japan and Australia and South Korea and to some extent India to fight all of this type of war. But there's one thing not well discussed. I think Dr. Hammer, he discussed a little bit. That's the geography. Next slide, please. Okay, this is the kind of conceptual map of how the Chinese see Chinese A2AD operations. And this happens to all the directions. So China has to think about the US and the force coming from South and Australian direction, or from the west and the Indian Ocean directions. But this is an example of the US forces from east. So when the US forces approaches the Chinese areas from east, the China would first employ the non-conventional warfare, EMP, anti-satellite, cyber cable network destruction. What's this? Disable or weaken the US heavily digital dependent command and controls and surveillance systems, and cut the nerve system connecting brain and muscle. And if this is successful, the overwhelming US forces would become a kind of the sitting duck, because the command from the brain does not go to the frontline fighting units. So this is the Chinese one objective of using the non-conventional warfare area. But anyway, US forces will approach. So around the line between Tokyo and Guam, China would start employing the anti-ship ballistic missiles, the DF-26 and 21s. 26 can reach Tokyo-Guam line and attack the US major asset like the carriers, amphibies, or strategic supply units. And also China would deploy conventional forces like submarines or AI mines or smart mines and ASR, anti-ship missile armed bombers, to attack US forces to decrease its capability. And if that is successful, the war will be Chinese side. And this is Chinese objective. And this is how China would fight when the real war happens. Again, next slide, please. Okay, then geography. My short way of saying is China can reclaim and make artificial island in the coral reefs in the South China Sea. But China cannot move the location of Taiwan, Okinawa, or Philippines. And exactly like Dr. Hammers mentioned, this geography may be an advantage for us, but also if we are stupid enough or not wise, this advantage could become a disadvantage for us. So we have to be careful. But one thing really true is South China Sea especially, and East China Sea are very, very heavily closed, semi-closed waters. And when we think about the Chinese submarine operations or large naval flotilla operations, there are only 3 choke points exiting from the South China Sea. One is the choke points between Taiwan and Philippines, Bashi Strait. And second one is the deeper area south of Mindanao. And the third is Lombok Strait. Those 3 are the only channels where the depth is larger than 100 meters. That means submarine can transit with submerged. But one worse element is there. That is 3 in archipelago choke points. One is just west of the Luzon Island and Palawan Island, Mindoro Straits, and Sibutu Passage between the Philippines and Malaysia, and one Makassar Strait in Indonesia. So when any Chinese major forces and submarines try to go out to the Pacific Ocean or Indian Ocean, they have to first pass through those 3 internal choke points, then go out to the outer oceans through 3 outer choke points. So this makes the Chinese naval operations very, very complicated and difficult. And many people say, how about Malacca Strait or Sunda Strait to the west? Yes, in the peacetime, they're okay, but they are too shallow, only 22 meters. So even today, the very large tanker bringing the oil to China, South Korea, and Japan do not pass through the Malacca Strait or the Sunda Strait. They use the southern route, Lombok Strait, and they go to the Mindanao Passage and go to their destination, Japan, South Korea, or China. And also, this is Dr. Hammer also mentioned, China is the large land country, but not self-sufficient. In order for China to maintain its manufacturing capability and to feed 1.4 billion populations, China has to import a lot from South America, Australia, and Africa. And all those maritime traffics has to pass through those choke points. So for us, when we think about the future combat or war or conflict or crisis with China, if we do not use those choke points wisely, we would be called 100 years later as the stupid allied nations centered around US, UK, Japan, Aussie, India. We would be called stupid man. That's the last thing we want to do. And also one more thing is, the Japanese island, Western Island. In the Cold War period, Japan focused 100% over Soviets. So we hardened our military facilities in the northern area, and western part is a kind of the forgotten area. So Japan just started hardening those bases, or even employing our ground forces to those western islands. But the other side of the coin of the Western Island defense is the Japan's choke point control over China to and from the East China Sea. So my point is the US and Japan and Aussie and India, we have to work together to develop a good concept to cooperate to build the better structure to cope with Chinese adventurism. And the role of the European countries, for example, the UK's announcement of its first deployment of the Queen Elizabeth battle group to this area will be very encouraging, because that's send a very clear signal that all the like-minded seafaring nations are getting together to cope with Chinese adventurism. And this is a very encouraging signal. So we are very happy about that. And I hope, and Japanese and the US hopes, German would join, France would join. If that would happen, much better. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Admiral. And finally, last but very much not least, Rear Admiral Parry, the floor is yours to take us home before Q&A.
Well, thanks very much. Good evening, everybody, and konnichiwa. Can I just confirm that you can see my slides that I've shared?
Yes.
Thank you. That's fantastic. Good. Okay, what I'd like to talk about is warfighting. It seems to be the uncle that is the funeral or the wedding. You get drunk every time and everybody's embarrassed to talk about. And we spent most of the day avoiding the actual business of warfighting. We've been trying to avoid it. We've been trying to stay in the grey zone, hybrid warfare. But actually, at the end of the day, our defense budgets depend entirely on the ability to warfight. And first of all, I want to talk about the problem with defense reviews. They're actually not designed to do anything about warfighting, because the resulting strategy that we get mostly from defense reviews is rarely a template for the pressing demands and practicalities of warfare should policy and deterrence fail, and that armed forces are actually required to fight, leading to situations where the declared ends of policies and national strategies really balance the ways and means by which they can be put into practice. Put simply, if you insert something into your national strategy, you should actually mean it. And right now, I see all around the world a whole load of strategies that don't actually mean it. They don't anticipate going to war. In fact, the defense reviews almost seem to be a deterrent posture in themselves to stop it actually happening. The other issue is that the future is never really how you expect it to be. And quite a lot of defense reviews assume that the future is going to be like the present, only more so. And again, this doesn't anticipate the way history operates. We've talked about this today already. And finally, I'd just like to share with you Trotsky's view, because this is the view I think that China and Russia has. You may not be interested in war with China and Russia, but they're really interested in war with you. And they talk about it and they write about it all the time. And we spend all our time evading the question, as we have today. And yet a similar conference which I attended with Russian academics, the only thing they talked about was war fighting, nothing else. And I beg your pardon, I actually skipped my line there. Okay, so here's Xi Jinping the last time he visited the Navy. This is what he said. This is what the Navy's for. We're not going to mess around in the grey zone. We're not going to talk about anything to do with anything other than fighting. And he means it. And we know from their building and the way they talk about it in the universities, that's what it's about. And I asked the question, are we really serious about war fighting? Who actually knows what they're talking about? I'd ask anybody at this conference to put their hand up and say, have you actually been in a naval war? Because I don't think you have. And the experience levels are really low in terms of what a naval war is about. Do our people think about war, or do they think about something that is a virtual game, something that happens to other people, something that happens the other side of the screen? Because the actual realities very rarely intrude into things. Do you know what you're dealing with? Your average sort of British warship, for example, has between 4 and 8 surface-to-surface missiles. Let's just have a look at our equivalent opponents, the Gorshkov class. How many, in your own mind, do you think it deploys? Well, the answer is anything between 16 and 24 anti-surface missiles. Let's go to Chinese 052 and 055 classes. They deploy anything up to 24, or indeed in one case, 36 anti-surface missiles. These are the platforms that we are up against. And even our friends have got the message too. If you look at the Israeli SAR 5 class, it's quite small, but actually it packs a hell of a punch, and it's got 16 surface-to-surface missiles. Now, these are countries that are looking at going to war at some stage, and they're meaning it. And I will say to you that if you wish to deter war, you have to look like you're prepared to go for it. So if you're not prepared for war, you better prepare for it. Next point, do we understand the effects that we want to realize at sea? I don't know about you, but I've got no interest in fighting in the Asia Pacific. I've got a real interest in squeezing Chinese merchant ships around the world and not fighting in their backyard. But I raise the question, do we understand the effects that we want at sea? Do we actually seriously design our platforms for combat anymore? I'll say to you, in the Falklands, our older ships survived hits pretty well. Our younger ships didn't survive at all. Our Type 42s were a disgrace. Our Type 21s got well plastered by bombs. And I ask you now, look around your fleets. Do we actually design for war? Do we actually train and exercise for war? Something Peter Roberts brought up this morning. We don't. We faff around all the time trying to pretend it's not happening. And have we kept up with the technological pace? I don't believe we have. If you look at Guadalcanal in the Second World War, none of the commanders knew about radar. And yet most of the escorts were fitted with radar. Battle of Savo Island, it was virtually useless because people didn't know how to use it. Let's look at usage of munitions, because we've not got a lot of stock in our locker at the moment. Look how much it took to suppress 2 Argentinian submarines in the Falklands War. Now, you might say that the combined cost of that is okay. That's less than the price of a frigate. There were no attacks that were successful by Argentinian submarines on British surface warships or any of the support ships. And indeed, we actually got one of them with 2 depth charges. But look at the cost involved. Again, look at the number of Sea Dart that were used, 31, of which between 7 and 9 hits were achieved. It's just not good enough. That's a 21% ratio. This is the sort of issues that we're going to face if we actually go to war. These are not factored in. And let's just think how long it'll take to actually manufacture any sort of sustainability in a war of, say, less than 2 months. That's the production line at Lockheed Martin. We can't produce at the same rate as the Chinese and Russians. They have industrial capacity. Remember what the United States was in World War II in terms of its depth of supply and resupply. That is where China is today. They can fight at industrial levels. So can Russia. We can't, and we're not even thinking how to mitigate this. Let's have a look at the damage. Our ships can take damage, yes, they can, but in all of these cases, from the Stark through the Sheffield through Glamorgan, the warhead didn't even detonate, and it put the ship out of action. Okay, there is actually the warhead recovered from the Stark. A 500-pound bomb in HMS Ardent, a snake eye, that completely writes the ship off. And all of these, if they don't sink the ship, they're actually involving in mission kill. What happens to a ship when it's hit by an Exocet which explodes? That's what happens to that ship. All these are mission failure. And that's even before we go to a heavyweight torpedo, which puts air in the bottom rather than, sorry, puts water in the bottom rather than air in the top. It's a ship sinker. We are not factorizing these things in. Testing and trials. We don't test enough. We don't trial enough. We have no confidence that our weapon systems are going to work when it comes to it. And I could tell you, there's the Sullivans firing off a standard missile. We know how many fail. I can't reveal it here. But their first presentation in the Falklands, the Seawolf failed. And I think it's notorious that the British, the German, and the American torpedoes fired from submarines in World War II failed utterly in the first year of the war. Why? Because we didn't use enough of them, we didn't test enough. And of course, the Japanese, God bless them, they used their long lance quite a lot. They did a lot of night fighting. And of course, first day of the war, they were very good at it. HMS Coventry sank on the 25th of May, 1982. We were able to rescue almost all the ship's company, apart from those who died. Let's just think about losing some of our ships in the wide areas of the Pacific or the Atlantic. Are we going to be able to rescue our people? And what will be the impact if we cannot rescue them? We haven't even given this a thought. We never think about losing our ships at this scale. That's what war fighting means. We're not even in that space. And here's a really important point. Both Russia and China say they will use nuclear weapons at sea. They calculate it's the one place where they might get away with it. North Korea has already threatened to fire a nuclear weapon into the sea. I pointed out recently at a conference that could have a carrier battle group underneath it. The one place, apart from space, where you might get away with it is at sea. And we haven't factored this into our nuclear theology or our escalation control. We are simply not thinking about the consequences of war fighting if we get it in sea and space. And the real point I want to ram home here, and I'm going to ask you to read this, is what Richmond Kelly Turner said at the after the Battle of Savo Island at the start of the Guadalcanal campaign in 1942. And it's really important that we think about this in relation to the way we plan for war and the way we actually think we ought to do it, because our opponents are doing the same. And it's this idea of being battle-minded in peacetime so that you can be battle-minded when you transition to full war. And if you're not ready for it, you end up, as he says in that last paragraph, with a fatal lethargy of mind, which induced a confidence without readiness and outworn peacetime standards of conduct. Quite shocking, okay, but pretty obvious. And then there's a very good academic called John Lundstrom. Look what he said about the leading edge of battle. And he ties in with what Richmond Kelly Turner has to say in that regard. So when I see somebody's lips stop moving, I'll carry on, but here we go. Okay. So what can be done? Okay, we've got to accept we never get the war that you expect. So we prepare for war in general, not for a war in particular. Strategic competition needs strategic readiness. Let's remember what we were like during the Cold War. If we wanted to deter at scale, at strategic, operational, tactical levels, our ships and our units had to be ready almost instantly for transition from deterrence to war fighting. That is not the case today. And many of our ships are going around very substandard in terms of equipment and training. Very sorry about that. Okay, if you get your war fighting posture right, deterrence will work. And to deter and, don't know why this is bouncing around, to deter and resist coercion, you need to have demonstrable capability. It's no good turning up with a pea shooter against the Admiral Gorshkov. They're not going to be impressed. And let's remember the distinctions between hard and soft power as used by warships today are simply means of influence, whether we fire a missile or we actually have a more graduated way of actually influencing someone's will. It's about influence. Soft power and hard power today are irrelevant. If you plan for war, you can adapt for routine operations, and your concepts and tactics need to anticipate future contexts and technologies. If you don't, you'll always be playing catch up. What we mentioned just now, there's going to be a battle-minded mentality during peacetime. That means you train as you intend to fight. And this is where the Japanese offer the best practice from World War II and before. And also the training ground is the battleground. If you don't train in the areas where you're expecting to fight, you're going to get kicked. So that's why we need to be in the Arctic. We need to be in the Asia Pacific. We need forward presence so that we can train where we expect to fight. And modular solutions in terms of manpower packages and equipment are really important. So systems in future are going to be much more important than platforms. So we can configure our platforms with the personnel and the systems that we need. And also that's cheaper too, because we can vary it. And I'm glad to say that the Littoral combat ship, the new British Type 31s and Type 26s, and the exceptionally good Danish ships are leading the charge in that respect. It's quite ironic, isn't it, that the country that invented Lego has got the best modular ships as well, but there we go. Also, we've got to think about our supply chains and our supply depth, because at the moment we're in the asymmetric situation, both in time and mass, in producing materiel. We've got to have technological assurance from testing and trialing our systems, and we've got to have realistic exercises and trials. And finally, we've got to study history. As Jim Mattis says, not in a whole career of 40 years can you amass the experience to be a competent commander. You need to lean on other people who've had this experience in the past. You've got to draw on empirical evidence and also best practice. Why do I say that? Because that's what the Chinese do. They do not go for Mahan. They don't go for Clausewitz. They don't go for enduring principles from which they get from the sacred texts. They look at best practice over 2,000 years of history. To give you one example, the Belt and Road by land and sea comes from the 15th century. The way they're trying to subvert our institutions comes from the 3rd century BC. They get best practice. I challenged the Chinese academic recently. I said, this is what we, the British, did to you in the 18th century. He said, yes, the Belt and Road is the East India Company in reverse. It's entrepot warfare.